go.
You got the red label, right? The red label?
No, this one's white. There was no red. This one's white.
It's just full of shit.
Was that intro stupid? Yes. Was it necessary? No. I want to thank my buddy Tyler for helping me film some of that intro, and I also want to thank Schiit for sending this out for me to review. Okay, so Fulla 4. This thing does a lot of things. It's got a lot of inputs, a lot of outputs, a lot of features on it. But one of the more impressive things about this is the build and the construction of these devices, because they're really well built. Like for $100, even though it's small, it's sturdy. And I do think that the layout is particularly nice, especially for an all-in-one like this that you're not going to be stacking with anything. This thing is great, using the volume knob on the top rather than the front, so you have much more granular control with the larger knob. The potentiometer on this feels great, and the input and output selection for a device like this is actually pretty nice. And then they've switched over since the last time I bought one of these things from the gray and silver to the red and black. Very similar to the Schiit Hell. Now in terms of inputs and outputs, you actually have quite a few options. Your headphone output is pretty typical, 1/4 inch out the front. Now on the front, you also have this analog input. Now unlike the Hell, this does not actually play into the computer through USB, at least not that I could get it to do. I believe that this is an analog input specifically to play like a phone or a laptop through the front here, out of the front into a pair of headphones, but you will need to separately power it if you're into that. Speaking of power, there are 2 USB-Cs on the back, and I think a lot of people might get this without reading the manual and be a little bit confused by what that means. So you have 2 options for powering this. Now you can, if you want to, run it off of a single USB-C from either your computer or your laptop, and even some phones, but I'm not sure on which ones have software that matches well with this. Or you can run it off the other USB-C option if you want to use something like the optical inputs or that front 3.5mm and you don't want to use the USB-C from your computer. And then you also have a variable pre-out out of the back. So that's a 3.5mm that is adjustable with the volume dial. So in terms of bang for your buck, in terms of features and build quality, this thing, like it's always been, is pretty nuts. And there are more expensive amplifiers that should have feature sets like this, especially moving over to more modern plugs like USB-C. I think that should be a standard for every DAC that's coming out nowadays, and it's unfortunately not. Okay, before we talk about sound, let's talk about options, because options are super important, especially at this price point where, you know, if you only have a certain amount of money to spend, you want to know what you can get that's going to maximize your sound output. Okay, I think these are your 2 options right now. Apple dongle with the 3.5 to RCA into the Magni. You can get the Magni Heresy, you can get the Magni 3 Plus, or this, which is the IE Magni. They're all going to do really well with just about every headphone on the market today, mostly because of the power output of the Magnis. The Magnis have insane power output. It's like 3 watts into 32 ohms. And they have pretty good measurements nowadays too. They have really low distortion numbers. These things are solid. Now this thing, I've mentioned this before, I actually mentioned it in the IE Magni review. These things are actually really underrated for specifications in terms of cleanliness. These things measure really low signal noise ratios, incredible dynamic range, and ultra low distortion numbers, and they're only $10. The problem with these is the output. They don't have a lot of volume with them, but that's where the amplifier comes in. So you can do one of 2 things. You can get the Lightning if you're using like an iPhone, or you can get the USB-C, and that will work with the laptops and your computers that have USB-C out, as well as other phones like Androids. And that'll play really well with this. So if you're gonna get a $120 Heresy and a $10 dongle for 130 bucks, I think for me personally, because I have those options and those outputs, this is what I would personally get over the Fulla. But the Fulla has a completely different use case and more options, and it's conveniently, you know, a pretty slim, small all-in-one, which I think is important. Okay, so when it comes to sound, my recommendation actually depends on what type of headphones you have and which ones you want to get later down the road. So this is not the most powerful amplifier, like we talked about already, but it can power more headphones than you might anticipate, but it does have an upper limit of what really starts to feel as fulfilled and as clean and as clear and as dynamic as it really needs to. And this line typically is going to get crossed with certain planars. Now for an example, this is a 2021 LCDX. This headphone is designed to be a very efficient planar magnetic headphone that this amplifier can actually run really well. It doesn't need a lot of power. Now, if you also have something like this Sundara, which is sort of in the medium range of difficulty to drive for planar magnetic headphones, you are going to be able to squeak out good performance out of this, though it won't be top tier for the Sundara. The volume will be okay, but with this, it becomes more of a battle of resolution and bass dynamics, things like that. I'm usually about halfway up for volume output of the Sundara. I could go louder in volume, but I don't really feel like I get a big benefit in terms of those bass dynamics and any treble resolution with going higher. This is one of those crossover headphones where, you know, between the Magni, I prefer the Magni on this personally, but this performance for the cost is really not that bad. But in terms of sound quality within the headphones that this does play, and it plays a lot of headphones really well. A lot of your dynamic headphones, like your Bay Dynamics, your Sennheisers, those are gonna perform pretty admirably on this. The sound quality though is pretty fantastic, but it does have a slightly warmer shift than what I would consider to be a perfect neutral, or like a reference grade amplifier. $400 would be the Magni Heresy. This is a little bit warmer than that amplifier is. It's a little bit less detailed in the top end, and the bass is a little bit more emphasized than what would be considered to be a reference. I don't think that this is a bad thing though. I think this could be a good thing depending on which headphones you have or what type of sound signature you like. Actually, I think that this is going to work really well for things like Bayer Dynamics that are a little bit more clinical in the top end. This will kind of cool them down, and you'll still have a ton of top end there and ton of top end available. It's still going to display a ton of that treble, but it's not going to come at it with a shiny or overly screechy performance. And that might actually be a benefit. Now, this does actually feel like sort of weird territory because this amp is competing in terms of price with things like the Heresy. And granted, the Heresy is not a DAC and it doesn't have all the features that this has. So it's really kind of apples and oranges. But when you compare it against the Heresy, you can kind of tell that the Heresy, if paired with a good DAC, it's a very good amplifier. You get like all the upsides. It's very clean. It's very dynamic. It's very powerful. It can run just about every headphone. But you do start to see some of the limitations here. But again, this is sort of apples and oranges, and this is designed to fit a different use case, a different user. And if I could speak directly to the users who are looking for like a small all-in-one unit like this, I think this performs pretty well. It definitely works better than a lot of the standard USB plug-in like small little DACs that I've used in the past. One, it's just about as powerful as any one of those I've seen, but it's also a little bit more capable in terms of the flexibility that it has, like we've talked about before. And that kind of wraps me up into my conclusion. So what's funny is a product of this caliber, of this type, at this price, a lot of what you're paying for is going to be a few things depending on the company. Some companies are going to focus only on sound quality. Some companies are going to focus only on features, and some companies are going to focus only on build. And I feel like this has the best mix of all of those, where you feel like you get a quality product from a build, a feature, and a sound quality perspective, and you don't have heavy sacrifices on any end. And that's kind of why I think this thing is still, to this day, probably the best DAC amp for about $100. Okay guys, thanks a lot for watching. Until the next video, my name's Josh, signing off. Bye.